Why is a universal beam called a universal beam? Firstly, a universal beam looks like this. It is a steel beam in the shape of a capital I, often just shortened to universal beam. Another name for it is wide flange beam because the flanges are so wide. Similarly, there is also a universal column, or often shortened to UC, which looks like this. It is easily identifiable over the UB because it is almost as tall as it is wide, or almost square. Now, I used to think that a universal beam had the word universal in it because of the fact that it could be used so universally. That is, in so many different applications and uses. Well, this certainly is true, but the name universal actually comes from the name of the machine that is used to make them, or what we call roll them. This steel profile in the shape of a capital I is made from a machine called a universal rolling mill, or sometimes just shortened to a universal mill. Here we can see it here. Here's a modern one. So this was an easy enough answer for me to find, but then I wondered, well, let's go back even further. Why was this machine called a universal rolling mill to begin with? Why the word universal? This was not an answer that I could find anywhere, so I started to read a lot of old texts and articles on the topic. I would keep finding references and information to the universal rolling mill that kept going back and getting older and older, and to my surprise went back as far as the mid-1800s. This is where I seem to hit a bit of a wall in the timeline, which suggests to me that this is the time period of its origin. The claims from my text certainly supports this, and it says basically this. So from my research, it is claimed by others that the man who invented the universal rolling mill was called John Arrowsmith of Bilston near Wolverhampton in England. I didn't find a lot of information on his invention, but I found quite a few references to him inventing this. So at the time, it didn't seem to be a big revolutionary idea in England, but his invention certainly fit all the principles of the universal rolling mill, but he didn't seem to call it a universal rolling mill at the time. But you can definitely attribute him to being the inventor because his design fits the principles. Mr. Arrowsmith of Bilton, we'll get into him a bit more in detail later in the video, but a few years after him, in 1848, Reinhard Dahlen of Germany built the universal rolling mill, which he called a universal Volkswerk in 1848. So reading old and modern German texts, they believe he was the inventor of the universal rolling mill. And the name of his machine certainly suggests that at least his name is where the word universal came from. So this is the oldest reference to the word universal for this machine that I could find. So I believe this is the origin of the word universal, but before that, John Arrowsmith seemed to invent the universal rolling mill, but he just didn't call it the universal rolling mill back then. So that was a bit of an overview, and now you're probably wondering, well, what is a universal rolling mill and how is it different from other rolling mills that shape steel? Also, what does the term rolling mean? First, please also know that the word steel profile just means steel shape, like the profile of your face, your shape, or the profile of corrugated iron, it's a shape. What shape is it basically? Is it a UB? Is it a PFC, parallel flange channel, an angle, like an L shape? What's its profile? Now, the word roll is used to roll a piece of steel, basically means to change its shape from one shape to another by passing it through cylinders that are rotating or rolling, which literally force the steel to change shape. So a good example to show you what rolling means is I can show you this video here, and you can basically see it's just like using a rolling pin in a kitchen where we roll out a piece of dough. That's the rolling action. It just forces the material into a different shape. Now we can go even further than this where we use two horizontal rollers now, one on top of each other, and you can see how it's rolling that piece of steel to flatten it out, making it thinner to a certain thickness. Um, Now, if we keep going even further, we can get even more complex where we start adding grooves into the rollers. So let's just search here, rolling mill rolling mill grooves. And you can see here they've got grooves in the rollers where you can pretty much get all sorts of different shapes, including eye-shaped beams or girders, um, and all these other different types of shapes. So something to understand is that this has a bit of a limitation. So the size of the grooves of that particular roller are fixed to the size of steel. So basically one roller for one size. It was a slow process because if you wanted to use um, a material to roll out a different size beam or whatever shape, you'd have to change over the rollers. So this is a bit of a limitation with this type of setup. Also, when it came to eye-shaped beams, you could still make them, but the flanges wouldn't be very wide. And I'll show you a bit of a picture here. Here's a good example here. You start off, by the way, you're supposed to roll it through various types of rollers and slowly change shape. So you start off with a rectangular shape, and you go like this, move along, and it slowly turns it into a bit of an eye shape until we get to the end here. And you can see these aren't very wide flanges. So, but back then they actually wanted ones with wider flanges. And what they used to actually do was, here's a picture here of a British standard beam. They used to actually sometimes add plate top and bottom to get those wide flanges. And I might be able to find a picture here. Here you go. There's one there. There's a universal beam there. So that was a bit of a limitation with that. So now we enter the universal rolling mill into the game. And the difference between what we just showed you and the universal rolling mill is the addition of more rollers, but this time, instead of two horizontal rollers, top and bottom, we introduce vertical rollers on the sides here. And this was a design of John Arrowsmith and Rainer Dalen. They had rollers on the side in the vertical plane. And the advantage of this is that you could actually just kind of move things in and out and actually change the shape of the steel that you want to roll. And this particular design doesn't have any grooves in it, but basically the gaps between the rollers is where the material is to pass through. So we can see here in the picture they're making an eye-shaped beam or a UB. I should point out that in different parts of the world they call them different things. So in America they now call them H beams or I beams. In the UK and Australia we call them UBs and UCs. I'm not quite sure about other parts of the world, but they're all basically the same thing. They're wide flange beams, and like that. That's Bethlehem. I'll show you that later on. So let's leave it on this for now. So, all right, so let's now go back to the very beginning. Let's go back to the start of the timeline. So all my readings will start with John Arrowsmith first. And I've got a source here, the universal mill, the principle of which is a simultaneous use of both vertical and horizontal rollers, yet we talked about that, had been invented in England in 1829. So that was the very oldest reference I could find to it being invented in that period. And we can see the little 2 here. Let's look down here. By Arrowsmith of Bilston, according to Bell and Walter Williams. I tried to look for whatever article this is referring to. I tried to look for Bell and Walter Williams. I couldn't find anything. I'm sure there's something out there. I just don't have access to it. So, John Arrowsmith of Bilston. Um, Now he was from England, of course. Um, so what can I show you next? So let's show you other snapshots referring to him. We can see an article here, a universal mill, for which a patent was taken out in 1860 by Mr. Arrowsmith of Bilston, although it was never applied by our own manufacturers for rolling flat bar. Mr. Arrowsmith is well known in Belgium as having laid down some of her best works. So I think he must have travelled to mainland Europe at some point and continued on in his type of field. We've also got something here that I found on Arrowsmith Pothouse Bridge Ironwork. So I'm thinking near Bilston. So I'm thinking must be where he made his invention or used to work. There's Arrowsmith there. Doesn't really talk about his invention, but it does kind of link him to the name of the actual business in the area. This is from 1850. I found that. What else have I found? So let's have a look here. So patent, we looked at that already. Pothouse, all right, so I read that already. I did anyway. So here's an old newspaper article from 1860 in the West Midlands, which is where Bilston is. John Arrowsmith of Bilston, Staffordshire, new and improved machinery for shaping materials. So this was a patent that he paid stamp duty on in 1853. So that support, it's not quite near 1829, but possibly he invented it and had it for a long time, but never patented it till later on, or maybe something completely different. I don't really know, but I wanted to look more into this patent. So new patents, here we go. This is 1860. You can see here another reference to John Arrowsmith, the same type of thing, improvements in the manufacture of beams and girders and in machinery and furnaces used in manufacture. Actually, this is a bit later on. This might be a bit different. Not quite sure. But I didn't really find any clear answers about him, Mr. Arrowsmith. This must be an article. It is by the means of the so-called universal mill designed by Mr. Arrowsmith that our friends in France are rolling their smooth edge plates. So that was another reference there. That's nothing. So let's now look at the patent. So I found a big list of patents, and I found his patent here, this one at least anyway, is 2789 for the manufacture of beams and girders. John Arrowsmith of Bilston in the county of Stafford. Improvements in the manufacture of beams and girders and in the machinery and furnaces used in the said manufacture in 1860, or 1859. So that was the same as what I just found in the newspaper article before. You can have a read through it. This is easy enough to find on Google Books. The first pair turn on horizontal axis and have this one has grooves and flanges. The girder passes through the rolls with its body in a horizontal plane and its flanges in a vertical plane. The second pair of rolls turn on vertical axis. So this is basically what we showed before, where it's got two rollers horizontal and two vertical. So this is why he was attributed to being the inventor of the universal rolling mill. But I've read through this. There's no mention of universal rolling mill. We just didn't call it that. But if you go down to the end of the patent, there's actually technical drawings here, and we can see there it is. There's the girder or the I-beam, and a bit hard for me to make out, but it looks like there's vertical and horizontal rollers, or this might not even be the one that he's referring to. I don't really know. It's not really clear. But that's all I could find about John Arrowsmith. So let's now move on to the next stage, which is now a few years later in 1848, we have Rainer Dalen. And I know from reading a lot of old German texts and modern one, I had to translate this from German. In 1848, he developed the universal rolling mill, in which the two horizontal rolls are supplemented by two vertical rolls. So we know all that already. So I've got some pictures here of his actual design, and see if I can find it. Got it here. Stuff I had to translate from German, Dalen's machine. So let's find his machine here. I'll just pause the video until I find it. Yeah, I'll just pause the video. All right, so I found it. Here it is here. And of course, Dalen's invention, he called it Universal Volkswerk. And in fact, if we go to Google, translate, I believe if we type that in, Universal Rolling Mill. So that's pretty clear that that's where the name came from. And that was the oldest reference I could find to the word universal being used when talking about that type of machine, where you've got the vertical and horizontal rollers. So this tells me that this is where the name universal came from. It came from Rainer Dalen and his Universal Volkswerk. And then it of course evolved over time, and the name stuck around, and then it got translated into Universal Rolling Mill in English, and that's why we have the name Universal Rolling Mill today. So that was Rainer Dalen. Now, Rainer Dalen, I can tell you a little bit about him. So in 1848, Rainer Dalen from Germany invented the rolling mill, blah, blah, blah. Gaps between, yep, can produce change in the rolls. Yet the universal rolling mill was first used at Pipe and Stock and Co. in Horde, which is near Dortmund. And we can probably bring up some articles here. So it's near the city of Dortmund, and I do have a picture. I do have a picture here of an old picture of the old ironworks. Let's just copy and paste it. So I do have old pictures somewhere, but I think I got one here. There we go. They call it the Hermerschutter, and that's a picture there. That's another picture as well. So that was Rainer Dalen, and and the Germans believe that he invented the universal rolling mill, but others would say no, it was actually an Englishman who invented it before him, but he just didn't call it the universal rolling mill. So the Paris exhibition. So we can go to the 1867 Universal Paris exhibition, where a guy from America, he's come over for looks like a bit of a visit, and this is when he kind of sees these things called universal rolling mills. Oh, what's that? So it is proper, however, to call the attention of our American makers of roll beams to the extraordinary specimens which we have described, and which it is understood are produced by the aid of the universal rolling mill. Of this, two forms were on exhibition, one in the pavilion and the other in the Austrian department. And you can see here one of the mills at the Piton Goudet and Co, which would have been a French one. So this is kind of the time when the Austrians had a universal roller mill. They were doing all sorts of things. The French did. I think Belgium and Luxembourg also had their own versions as well. But it really started becoming a bit of thing and really kind of well known. That's when the Americans started kind of getting involved then. And I can actually show you. No, I can't. So a few references. In 1864, a French rolling mill made some beams 43 inches in depth on a universal type beam mill, a forerunner to the present day universal beam mills. So they were starting to kind of make a lot of things around that period. Then the Americans got on board, and now we enter such names like Henry Gray and Bethlehem Steel. But first, let's just look at a quick bit of speech that I translated from French. So universal rolling mill for large plates. The universal groove, that is to say the groove whose sides verticals are formed by the generators of two cylinders with the axis of vertical cylinders placed behind or in front of the horizontal cylinders. So I think this is where the name universal comes from. It's the fact that you can kind of move these rollers into all these different sizes, and it's just so universal. So that's where the name originated from. So now let's get past that. This is an old German thing. That's Dalen's. A little bit about the French here that I translated, but we won't really get into that. Also, I should mention I did find some information on the Trenton Iron Company in New Jersey. Apparently designed a universal type mill. I couldn't really find much more information about this, so if you know something, please let me know. So let's get in now into Henry Gray. So based on Dalen's Universal Rolling Mill, around the 1897-1901, an English/American engineer. He was working in Luxembourg for a bit, but then at some point he went over to America and worked with Bethlehem Steel. And in 1987, Henry Gray developed a new rolling mill process that Charles Schwab brought to the Bethlehem Steel Corporation to produce wide flange I-beams and H-beams compared to standard beams, which I think are similar to British standard beams. These Gray or Bethlehem beams increased strength, lowered weights, and saved money in material and construction. They were introduced commercially in 1908. Bethlehem beams changed the structural steel industry and helped define the modern Bethlehem Steel Company. It was a trademark logo. We go on further. Once Bethlehem Steel Corporation obtained the Gray rights, production and selling rights of this new product, it forever changed the company. So here's an old book here. We can see Bethlehem Structural Steel, and you can see the Gray beams there. There are other names involved too with different developments of different rolling mills over time, like I saw Sack and York, and they're people's last names, but we're not really going to get into this. So in England in the early 1900s, the universal mill was still not really in favour, as rolling mill engineers believed that faster work or simple mills were more than makes up for the necessity for changing the groove rolls at intervals when a new width is to be produced. So the British kept using these kind of old standard beams for quite a long time. But what ends up happening around the early 50s, late 40s is when they start to use universal beams and columns. So the British Standard Institution published a revised BS4. So British Standard 4, one of the very first ones, specified all the girders and joists and stuff. But if we go down further here, following the introduction of universal beams and columns section in 1959, BS4 was amended to cover these sections and the specification was split into two parts. So in in 1959 is when Britain started to kind of really get involved in these universal beams as opposed to the standard British beams. There's a universal beam there. So I do have a few things we can look at. Actually, this is an old article from Pittsburgh in 1874. The universal system of rolls, from its adaptability to roll any size of plate beyond the reach of the grooved rolls, has become a great favourite with the manufacturers of iron. And there are quite a numerous amount in operation in this city. Carnegie and Clonman, sorry if I didn't pronounce that right. It is said to have the largest and finest universal mill in the United States. That was an interesting snippet from an old newspaper article I found. So here we go now. We're in 1908. Bethlehem Steel, the new Henry Gray, universal beam mill of the Bethlehem Steel Corporation, which has been building for the last year or two and has been in operation. If we keep going through here, that's right. I thought that might have been something mentioned about the universal rolling mill, but that's what it is. Let's have a look at the next one. Okay, so now we're back over in the UK in 1945. So £8 million plant for steel firm, new universal beam mill, a new universal beam mill, the first in Britain, and a new steel plant are to be built on Teesside by Dorman Long and Co. And if we go back to the very beginning, this was Dorman Long, universal beams, 1960. This is from an old catalogue. So let's go back and have a look at this. Too many to look at now. The central feature of the project is a universal beam mill, which will produce a broad flange section and will revolutionise about 75% of the steel and joist production of the country. So that was a good read. And then what have we got next? So where are we? We're in 1945. Universal beam has a section like a capital H. That's just talking about what they are. And now we got one from 1961. The first wide flange beam produced in the United Kingdom were rolled at the Cargo Fleet Works in 1946. There you go. Since that date, the range of size has been extended from the universal mills. So we've got more talk about the universal mills being used in Britain at this period in time. Let's go back to here now. So this is when they introduced the universal beam and universal columns. It was 1959. And that's basically when it all kind of started. And then some years after that, Australia revised their Australian standards and they started calling them universal beams and universal columns. So let's kind of conclude now. So why is a universal beam called a universal beam? What does the word universal mean? Well, it stems all the way back to Rainer Dahlen's invention, which he called universal Volkswerk, which looked like this. And it was said to be universal because you can kind of wind these in and out and change different sizes. It was just so universal compared to the old style, just two hard rollers. If you have any more information I couldn't find, please let me know. Please put it in the comment section. But I hope this was helpful for anyone else looking for information on this subject. Thank you.